The Exile. The kingdom of Valdris cast out Kale without ceremony. There was no public square, no crowd gathered to witness the moment, no official proclamation read aloud from the stone steps of the royal hall. There was only a guardroom that smelled of tallow and wet iron, two soldiers who would not meet his eyes, and a door that opened onto the eastern road before dawn had properly broken over the capital. They gave him what they were required to give a dismissed soldier. A sword old and notched along one edge, its grip wrapped in leather that had cracked and darkened with the sweat of whoever had carried it before him. They gave him a satchel with enough dried meat and hardtack to last perhaps 4 days if he was careful, perhaps 3 if he wasn't. They gave him nothing else, no coin, no cloak against the late autumn cold, no words of explanation or farewell. The door closed behind him, the bolt slid home. Kale stood on the eastern road for a long moment, the pre-dawn wind pulling at his hair, the city still dark and silent at his back. He had served Valdris for 11 years. He had crossed its rivers and defended its borders and bled into its soil more times than he could accurately count. He had carried the kingdom's banner into 7 different engagements, had trained its younger soldiers, had eaten its black bread in 100 different camps across a dozen different seasons. He had given it everything a man could give a kingdom short of his life. And now the kingdom had handed him a borrowed sword and opened a door and expected him to understand. He understood. He had understood the moment he lowered his torch in the village of Imren and told the captain beside him that he would not do it. His crime officially was treason. The word had been used in the closed hearing 3 days before his exile, spoken by men in formal robes who did not look at him while they said it. Treason against the crown, defiance of a direct military order, willful undermining of royal authority in a time of campaign. The words were large and formal and carefully constructed, and they meant, when stripped to their actual truth, something much simpler and far more damning. He had refused to burn a village on his king's order, and mercy had no place in a king's army. Imren was not a military target. It was a farming settlement of perhaps 200 people, old men, women, children, a few dozen working-age adults who had done nothing more threatening than exist in a valley the king had decided he wanted to make an example of. The order had come down through the chain of command, wrapped in the language of strategy and necessity, the way such orders always did, and the soldiers around Kale had lifted their torches and begun to move, because soldiers who wanted to keep being soldiers learned not to look too closely at what they were being asked to do. Kale had looked. He had seen a girl standing in a doorway with a clay water jug clutched to her chest, watching the line of soldiers approach with an expression that was too frightened to be fully comprehended yet. He had seen an old man trying to explain something to a younger soldier who wasn't listening. He had seen the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of lives that had nothing to do with any war, arranged in the particular way that people arrange their lives when they believe they are safe. He had lowered his torch. The captain had given him a direct order. He had refused it. The captain had threatened him with consequences. He had refused again. 3 days later, he was in a guardroom smelling of tallow and wet iron, and then he was on the eastern road before dawn, and that was the whole of it. He turned away from the city and walked. For months, Kale wandered the wild lands beyond the kingdom's reach. The first weeks were the strangest. He had spent his entire adult life inside a structure, the army's rhythms, its schedules, its hierarchies, its particular and relentless sense of purpose. Even a bad day in service had the shape of a day with a direction to it. Out here, east of the kingdom's border markers, time spread out around him like water finding its own level, formless and indifferent, and he had to learn all over again how to move through it without the scaffolding of orders and duties holding him upright. He was not entirely without skill. 11 years of campaigning had taught him things that were useful now in ways they had never been intended for. He knew how to read weather in the color of an early sky. He knew which plants could be eaten and which would make a man wish he hadn't, and he knew how to find water in terrain that seemed to offer none. He could set a fire without flint if he had to, could sleep lightly enough to wake at sounds that didn't belong, could navigate by stars on clear nights and by the lean of moss on the north faces of stones when the sky was closed over with cloud. He hunted what he could with a short bow he built himself over 2 days from a yew branch, and he slept beneath open skis on a bedroll he fashioned from layered pine boughs, and he moved eastward without a destination because east was the only direction that had any logic to it, being the direction away from Valdris. What surprised him was not the hardship. Hardship was familiar terrain. What surprised him was the silence, not the absence of sound, because the wild lands were full of sound, full of wind and water and the movement of animals in the undergrowth. But the silence of not being spoken to, of not being given a name to answer to, of not existing in relation to any institution or expectation. He had not realized how much of his sense of himself had been built from the outside in, assembled from rank and roll and the regard of other soldiers, until all of that scaffolding was gone and he was left to discover what remained. What remained was quieter than he expected, harder to locate, but it was there. He slowly forgot what it felt like to belong anywhere, and in the forgetting, something else emerged, something that did not require belonging in order to continue. He was not sure it had a name. He carried it with him eastward through the turning of the seasons, through the slow stripping of the trees and the first hard frosts and the particular gray clarity that settled over the land when winter began to consider itself seriously. The forest thinned eventually into the Stoneback Mountains. He had heard of the Stoneback Range in the way that people hear of places they have no intention of visiting, as background information, as the edge of the world beyond the edge of the world. Even during his years in the Eastern campaigns, the mountains had remained a remote abstraction, mentioned occasionally by local guides or veteran soldiers in the tone that people reserve for things they have decided not to think about too carefully. Strange lights pulsed behind the cliffs at night, they said. The ground trembled without cause. Travelers who ventured too deep were never seen again, though no one could say exactly why, and the not knowing was in some ways worse than any specific accounting would have been. The mountains rose before him gradually, as large things do, becoming more real with every mile until they filled the entire northern horizon and then the eastern one, and then, as the forest gave way to rocky scrubland, seemed to surround him on multiple sides at once. They were not beautiful in any conventional sense. They were massive and dark, and they had the quality of things that have been exactly what they are for longer than anything human can meaningfully understand. The rock faces were black and streaked with mineral deposits that caught the low winter light in ways that made them look, at certain angles, almost wet. The passes between the peaks were narrow and choked with loose stone that shifted underfoot with an unsteadiness that was not quite dangerous, but was never quite comfortable either. The wind was different in the mountains. It came from directions that didn't correspond to each other, multiple currents meeting and parting in the narrow spaces between rock faces, so that a man moving through a pass might feel it on his left cheek and then his right and then full in his face within the span of a dozen steps. It carried smells he couldn't identify, mineral and cold, and something else beneath those, something organic and ancient like the smell of a deep cave. Cale had stopped fearing death somewhere along the eastern road. He had not made a decision about it exactly. It was less a decision than a gradual erosion, the way a riverbank loses ground to water over time without any single moment you could point to and say there, that is when it happened. He had been afraid of death the way any soldier is afraid of it. Practically and constantly, the fear folded into every tactical calculation, every reading of a battlefield, every moment of deciding whether to advance or hold. That fear had been useful. It had kept him alive through 7 engagements and more individual close calls than he liked to catalog. But fear of death requires, at its foundation, a sufficiently strong attachment to the continuation of one's own life. And somewhere on the long eastern road, in the weeks of solitary wandering and the slow dismantling of everything he had built his identity around, that attachment had loosened its grip. Not to the point of wanting death. He was clear-eyed enough to understand the difference between that and where he was, but to the point where death had stopped being the primary argument against doing something. So he climbed. He entered the Stoneback Mountains in the early days of deep winter, moving through the lower passes with the careful efficiency of a man who has spent years learning how to move through difficult terrain. The air thinned as he ascended. The sounds of the world below, wind in forest canopy, the distant call of birds, the occasional creak of settling wood all fell away, replaced by the more immediate sounds of stone and cold and his own breathing. At night, the strange lights pulsed behind certain cliff faces, just as the stories had described, faint and amber-colored and rhythmically slow, like something enormous breathing. He watched them and found them more interesting than frightening. Most frightening things, in his experience, became interesting once you decided you were going anyway. On the 3rd day into the mountains, he found the nest. He came around the edge of a large rock formation into a natural stone basin, a wide, roughly circular depression in the mountain's face, sheltered on 3 sides by rising cliff walls and on the 4th by the overhang of black rock that jutted out above it like a massive stone brow, creating a space that was not quite a cave but considerably more sheltered than open ground. The basin was perhaps 40 feet across, its floor relatively flat, the stone worn smooth by what might have been centuries of use. He stopped moving the moment he registered what was inside it. 7 eggs sat arranged in a careful circle near the center of the basin, each one roughly the size of a large barrel, slightly elongated, their shells a deep gray-brown that was not their own color but rather a surface texture, because beneath that texture each egg pulsed with a warm amber light, slow and regular and deeply alive, like coals that had been burning steadily for a very long time and intended to continue. The light did not flicker. It breathed. And the interval of that breathing, the slow brightening and gentle dimming, repeated over and over in the cold mountain air, was hypnotic in a way that made Cale stand completely still for a full several seconds before he remembered to take in the rest of the basin. The mother dragon was curled around the eggs in the way that large animals curl around things they are protecting, not encircling them entirely, but positioned with her body between them and the most likely direction of approach, which happened to be exactly where Kale was standing. She was enormous. He had heard descriptions of dragons over the years, had even seen what was purported to be a dragon's tooth once in a merchant's stall, but descriptions and teeth were poor preparation for the actual scale of the creature before him. Her body, coiled as it was, occupied perhaps a third of the basin's floor space. Her scales were silver, truly silver, not gray, with a quality to them that reminded him of the way moonlight sits on still water, a depth of reflectivity that seemed to go beyond the surface. Her wings were folded against her sides, their upper edges cresting above her back like the ridgeline of a collapsed tent. She raised her head when she heard him. He had been prepared in some abstract way for fire, for the lunge of a massive body, for the territorial aggression of an animal defending something irreplaceable. He had not been prepared for the sound that came from her throat, which was not a roar and not a hiss, and not any of the threatening vocalizations he might have anticipated. It was something low and sustained, a sound with exhaustion in it, a sound that had been going on for some time before he arrived and would continue after he left if he left without incident. He recognized it. He had heard it before, not from animals, but from soldiers who had been holding a position alone for too long. The sound of something that was not going to stop, but was running on reserves it had no reliable way to replenish. He understood her injury in the next moment, when she shifted her weight slightly and the movement revealed the source of a dark stain that had spread across the silver scales of her left side. A crossbow bolt military weight, the kind used by siege units, not hunting equipment, was lodged beneath her left wing where the scales were thinner and the anatomy more vulnerable in the gap that opened when a wing extended, the gap that a hunter who knew dragons would know to aim for. The bolt had not been removed. The scales around it were dark with blood that had dried and then remoistened and dried again, and the surrounding tissue, even from a distance, had the swollen, overwarm look of a wound that was developing complications it did not have the resources to fight properly. She was injured, exhausted, and she had clearly been in this state for some time. She had clearly been in this state while still maintaining the vigilance and the warmth and the careful regulation of the nest. She had been doing both things at once, protecting and suffering, for however long it had been since the bolt found her, and she was going to continue doing both things until she physically could not, because that was what the situation required of her. She watched him with golden eyes. They were extraordinary eyes, not the flat, reactive eyes of a reptile, but eyes with genuine depth to them, eyes that were performing a complex and rapid assessment of the situation, weighing variables against each other, arriving at conclusions. What he saw in them was not anger. It was not the wild fear aggression of a cornered animal. It was the desperate, calculating stillness of a mother who had already made her decision, and was waiting to see if this new variable would require her to act on it. She had already decided she would die before she moved from those eggs. He could see that as clearly as he had ever read anything in a living face. Kale set down his sword. He did it slowly and without drama, crouching to place it on the stone, then straightening and taking 2 deliberate steps away from it. He kept his hands visible and open. He held her gaze without the particular kind of eye contact that animals read as challenge, steady but not fixed, present but not threatening. He found a stone outcropping at the basin's edge, perhaps 15 feet from where she was coiled, and he sat down on it. He spoke quietly. He had learned the technique with horses. In the years before, campaign horses had just been cavalry assets and had instead been individual animals with individual characters that a writer learned to read and work with. The content of what you said mattered less than the quality of it, the pace, the evenness, the absence of any sudden shift in register. You were communicating something below the level of language. I am not afraid of you, and I am not here to take anything, and I understand that you have no particular reason to believe that, and I am going to stay here and keep talking until the information accumulates. He told her he meant no harm. He used those words specifically, plainly, without embellishment, and then he kept talking, giving her other words to sit alongside those ones. He told her about the Eastern Road. He told her about Imren and the girl with the water jug and what it had cost him to lower his torch. He told her about the months of wandering and what the silence had been like and what it had slowly revealed. After a long silence that he did not try to fill or push through, he told her that he knew what it was to have nothing left but one thing worth protecting. He said it simply, the way you say things that are true without any additional material around them. He looked at the 7 eggs pooling their slow amber light in the basin's cold air. He looked at her, injured and immovable and utterly committed to the singular task remaining to her. He said it again quietly. He knew what that was. She did not move, but she did not breathe fire either. There was a long moment in the mountain cold in which neither of them did anything except exist in each other's presence. The former soldier and the silver dragon, two exiled things at the far edge of the world, and in that moment something settled between them that was not trust yet but was the very first necessary condition for trust, a mutual recognition that the other was not simply a threat to be responded to, but something more complicated and more worth attending to than that. He took that as permission. The mountain wind moved through the basin, carrying its mineral cold, and the amber light of 7 eggs pulsed its slow and patient rhythm, and Kale remained where he was and did not leave. The vigil. He removed the bolt over the course of an afternoon. It was not a clean task. Military crossbow bolts were not designed to come out easily. They were designed to go in and stay, to cause maximum structural damage on entry and maximum additional damage on any attempt at removal. The head of this one had spread slightly on impact, the way broadhead bolts did when they struck something dense, and it had lodged itself at an angle between 2 scale plates and into the muscle and connective tissue beneath, embedding deep enough that Kale could not simply pull it free without causing the kind of secondary tearing that would transform a serious wound into a fatal one. He worked slowly, there was no other way to work. He talked the entire time, not nervously, not to fill silence, but with the same deliberate steadiness he had used when he first sat down on the stone outcropping and introduced himself to her. He narrated what he was doing before he did it, explaining each step in plain language, giving her time to brace for discomfort before the discomfort arrived. He was not certain how much of his language she understood in a literal sense, but he had a strong intuition that the intent carried through regardless, that she could read in the quality of his voice what the specific words were doing, warning her, preparing her, maintaining contact across the distance between 2 very different kinds of creature who had, for reasons neither of them had planned, ended up in the same place. She endured it with a stillness that humbled him. He had treated wounded animals before and wounded men, and the usual quality of that experience was resistance. The animal body's instinctive rebellion against pain, the involuntary flinching and pulling away, the need to restrain or to soothe past the panic that pain triggered even in the most disciplined of creatures. She gave him none of that. When his work caused her pain, and it did unavoidably several times during that long afternoon, she absorbed it without any movement that would have complicated what he was doing. Her golden eyes remained open and fixed on a point in the middle distance, and the only indication of what she was feeling was a slight deepening of her breathing and once, a very controlled and contained exhalation of heat that warmed the air around him without directing itself at him. She was choosing her stillness. That was what humbled him. It was not the stillness of unconsciousness or shock, but the stillness of a creature exercising tremendous deliberate restraint because it had decided to trust a process it could not fully control. He had asked for her cooperation without being in any position to guarantee that his help would not cause more harm than good, and she had extended that cooperation anyway, on the basis of nothing more substantial than the quality of his voice and the fact that he had set down his sword. He thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it cost to trust something you had every reasonable cause to fear. The bolt came free in the late afternoon, when the mountain light was beginning to take on its cold blue quality and the shadows in the basin had stretched to cover most of the floor. Kale held it in his hand for a moment, heavy, dark with old blood, unremarkable in every way except for the fact of what it had done and where it had been, and then set it aside on the stone. He packed the wound with the moss he had been gathering since early morning, a particular variety he had learned to use in the eastern field camps, dark green and dense, with properties that slowed bleeding and had some effect against the kind of infection that developed in deep puncture wounds. He had found it growing in the shaded crevices of the lower cliff faces and had harvested it carefully, more than he thought he would need, because with a wound this size there was no such thing as too much preparation. He bound it with strips torn from his cloak, working the cloth in layers, tight enough to maintain pressure but not so tight as to restrict the movement of the wing entirely. His cloak was the only substantial piece of fabric he had, and by the time he finished there was not much of it left. He was aware of this in a practical way. Winter in the Stoneback Mountains without a proper cloak was a meaningful problem. But the awareness sat at some distance behind the immediate focus of the work, and he noted it and let it be. When it was done, she lowered her great head back to the rim of the nest. The exhale that followed was long and full, a breath she seemed to have been holding for a very long time, and it carried in it the smell of smoke and pine, deep and resinous and warm, a smell that was nothing like the cold mineral air of the mountain and everything like something alive and ancient and enormously, fundamentally itself. Kale sat back on his heels in the snow and breathed it in, and something in him that had been wound tight for months, for years perhaps, loosened a single careful increment. He looked at her, her great silver head resting on the stone rim, her golden eye still open but softer now, the 7 amber eggs pooling their slow light in the basin behind her, and he thought that he had not felt useful in a very long time. It was a strange thing to notice and a stranger thing to feel. Kale stayed. He told himself it was only for a night because the wound needed monitoring and because it was late and the lower passes would be treacherous in the dark. The logic was sound enough that he did not look at it too closely. He built a small fire at the basin's edge, close enough to the entrance that the smoke dispersed into the pass rather than filling the enclosed space. And he sat beside it and watched the mountain go dark around him and listened to the slow, even breathing of the dragon and the faint crystalline sound the eggs made when the temperature dropped sharply in the deep hours of the night. A sound like glass, barely audible, that he eventually understood was the shells adjusting, flexing microscopically against the cold, maintaining their inner warmth through some property of their own construction. He slept eventually, lightly and briefly, and woke to gray dawn and the smell of smoke and pine. He told himself it was only for another night. Then another. By the end of the first week, he had stopped telling himself anything in particular about how long he would stay. He had begun instead to organize his days around the practical requirements of the situation, which was a different and more honest relationship with the question. The wound needed daily attention for the first several days, cleaning fresh moss, monitoring for the heat and swelling that would indicate deepening infection. The dressing needed replacing. He needed to eat, and eating meant hunting. And hunting meant descending to the lower valleys, where game was present in the thin scrub and frozen meadows below the snowline. He hunted in the lower valleys and brought back what he could. He was a competent hunter, years of campaign living had made sure of that, but the Stoneback Range was not generous terrain, and the winter was settling in with the particular seriousness of mountain winters, which operate differently from lowland ones, more absolute and less negotiable. What he could find was limited. He brought back rabbits and twice a lean mountain deer, and on one fortunate afternoon a brace of large birds he startled from a sheltered ledge. He dressed and cooked what he needed for himself and set portions near the nest, at first at some distance, pushed forward on a flat stone to the edge of where the dragon's awareness seemed to sharpen into active attention, and then closer as the days accumulated, until eventually he was leaving the food within a few feet of her. She observed these offerings for the first several days without approaching them, watching him with her golden eyes from across the basin while the meat sat untouched on its stone. He did not try to encourage her or demonstrate the food's safety or perform any of the gestures of enticement. He simply left it and went back to his own fire, and either she would eat it when she was ready or she wouldn't, and either way it was her decision to make. She ate it on the 5th day. He was on the far side of the basin when it happened, his back turned toward her, and he heard the soft particular sound of it and did not turn around. She began to accept the offerings without suspicion. As the weeks passed, Kale learned her rhythms. He learned them the way you learn the rhythms of a place or a creature you are living alongside, not through study or intention, but through the gradual accumulation of observation, the slow building of a map in the mind's eye. He learned that she slept most deeply in the 2 hours before dawn, when the cold was at its most intense and the basin was very quiet, and that during this sleep her breathing slowed to something almost geological, so deep and so infrequent that if he had not already known what she was he might have thought the rise and fall of her ribcage was a trick of the low light. He learned that she watched the sky most intently around midday, her head raised above the basin's rim, her eyes tracking something that was either specific aerial threats or the general movement of the world above the mountains, and that during these vigils she was at her most alert and would track his movements even when he was quiet and distant. He learned when she turned the eggs. This happened twice each day, once in the early morning and once in the late afternoon, and it was the thing he watched most carefully and most willingly. She did it with a tenderness so careful it seemed impossible for something so large. She used her snout and the broad, flat inner surface of her foreleg, nudging each egg with a precision that was clearly practiced and clearly intentional, shifting each one a specific and considered amount, then pausing, then adjusting, as if she was calibrating something according to internal information he had no access to. The care she brought to it was absolute. There was nothing of the automatic in it, nothing mechanical or habitual. Every rotation of every egg received the same full and present attention, as if each one were the only one. He watched this and said nothing. There was nothing to say, there was only the watching. He began to think of her as a kind of exile. The thought arrived not as an analysis but as a recognition, the particular quality of knowing something not because you have worked it out but because you have simply seen it clearly. Dragons had been hunted to the far edges of the world. This was not a secret or a historical abstraction. It was an ongoing fact, written in the empty spaces where dragons had once been present and were no longer. He had grown up in Valdris hearing stories of dragon sightings the way people spoke of things that had happened in their grandparents' time. Stories with the quality of a world that had been larger once and had contracted. The hunting had been systematic and enormously profitable. The eggs and scales and bones and blood all commanding fortunes in markets that asked no questions about provenance. And the result had been the slow and thorough removal of dragons from every place where human beings also wanted to be. She had come here to the most remote and inaccessible corner of the most avoided range of mountains in the eastern lands, and she had built her nest in a stone basin hidden beneath a rock overhang, and she had arranged her eggs in their careful circle, and she had asked nothing from anyone except to be left alone. He understood that completely. He understood it in the marrow of him, with the particular depth of comprehension available only to someone who has also been pushed to the far edge, and has also found themselves wanting nothing more extraordinary than a place to simply be, without justification or apology, without having to defend the right to continue. He sat by his small fire in the evenings and looked at her and thought that loneliness was perhaps less about the absence of others and more about the absence of being known, about existing in a world that had decided, for whatever its reasons, that you did not fit within the frame of what it was willing to accommodate. He had felt that loneliness on the Eastern Road. He felt it still in the way that things felt once tend to leave a residue, but here in the stone basin with the amber light of 7 eggs and the slow breathing of a silver dragon, it had changed its quality. It had become something less like an absence and more like a context. He was not less alone here. He was alone among other things that were also alone and somehow that was different. He stayed, he did not tell himself how long. Word found the mountains before winter did. He should not have been surprised. He understood in retrospect that he had not been thinking clearly about this, had been too absorbed in the daily requirements of the vigil, too settled into the rhythms of the basin to properly attend to the world below the snowline and what it might be doing. Dragon nests generated rumors the way warmth generated condensation, inevitably and through simple physics. Someone had seen lights in the Stoneback Range. Someone had noted a pattern in the lights that was different from the usual background strangeness of the mountains. Someone had told someone else, and that person had told someone with money and appetite, and the apparatus of the egg trade had begun its slow and purposeful grinding. He heard them 2 days before he saw them. The mountains carried sound in particular ways, funneling it through the passes and amplifying it against the cliff faces, and the sounds of men moving in cold mountain terrain, the clink of equipment, the muffled percussion of boots on frozen rock, the occasional low voice, reached him well before their owners did. He spent those 2 days thinking carefully about what was going to happen and what he was going to do about it. And at the end of the 2 days, he had not arrived at any conclusion that changed the basic shape of things. So he stopped thinking about it and started preparing instead. A party of 6 hunters arrived from Valdris, heavily armed, experienced, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. They came up through the eastern approach to the basin, the same route Kale had used weeks earlier, and they were good enough to have found the right pass on the first attempt, which told him something about the quality of whatever intelligence they were working from. Dragon eggs sold for fortunes. He knew this in the same general way he knew most facts about the economy of things he had never been personally involved in as background information that suddenly sharpened into relevance. They sold to collectors who wanted them as status objects, to alchemists who wanted them for the properties attributed to the shells and the yolk, to noblemen who wanted power they didn't earn, which was the oldest and most reliable market for anything in any kingdom he had ever served. 6 heavily armed men had calculated that the investment of their effort and risk would be returned many times over by the contents of the basin above them. They had calculated correctly on all the variables they had accounted for. They had not accounted for the man camped at the nest's entrance with a rusted sword and no intention of stepping aside. Their leader was a broad man in layered leather and chain, carrying a short axe and a crossbow, with the particular quality of stillness that came from a certain kind of professional experience. Not a soldier's stillness but a hunter's, the patience of someone who was accustomed to waiting for the right angle. He looked at Kale for a long moment when they came around the last bend and found him standing in the pass. And in that moment, Kale could see him revising his assessment of the situation, updating it for the presence of an unexpected variable. They gave him one chance to move. The leader said it plainly, without particular cruelty or drama, the tone of a man who was used to obstacles that could be reasoned with, offering the most efficient path through the current one. There was good money in this for anyone who stepped aside. There was no money in it for anyone who didn't, and considerably less future. These were the terms. He had time to consider them. Kale looked at him. He looked at the 5 men arranged behind him, spread across the width of the pass in the professional way that men spread when they were preparing for the possibility that the conversation might end in a particular direction. He looked at the crossbow. He looked at the short axe. He did not take it. He had made his decision 2 days ago during the long thinking. He was not going to relitigate it now. The fight was short and brutal and entirely one-sided in every way but one. Kale was one man. He had been living on inadequate food in severe mountain conditions for months, and the lean competence that this had created in him was real but operated within limits that were also real. He was not the soldier he had been in his 11th year of active service, carrying the kingdom's banner across 7 engagements with the full support of a military apparatus behind him. He was a man in a borrowed cloak, a borrowed sword, standing in a narrow pass in deep winter with no allies and no reinforcements and no particular expectation of survival. What he had was the pass itself. The entrance to the basin was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, and flanked on both sides by rock walls that made approach from the sides impossible and required the hunters to come at him in sequence rather than simultaneously. This was the one variable he could control, and he controlled it completely. He used the width of the pass to deny them the advantage of numbers, forcing them to engage him 1 and then 2 at a time, making the ground cost them what the numbers wouldn't. He held the narrow pass at the basin's entrance and made it cost them every inch. The first hunter came at him hard and confident, and was surprised by how much resistance a single tired man in a narrow space could generate. Kale was not fighting to win. He understood from the first exchange that winning, in the conventional sense, was not the available outcome. He was fighting to hold, which was a different discipline and one he knew from the siege work of his middle years in service. The kind of fighting where the objective was not to defeat the force against you, but to deny it forward progress for as long as possible. 2 hunters fell in the pass, for reasons that had everything to do with the geometry of the engagement and very little to do with any heroic quality of Kale's performance. The pass was simply unforgiving of the errors that came with overconfidence, and the hunters had arrived with a confidence calibrated to a situation that did not include a trained soldier who had already decided how this ended. A third hunter retreated, clutching his arm. But the numbers were what they were. 3 men and a leader remained, and they were angry now in the way that hunters became angry when something smaller than them had cost them something, and anger in a narrow pass was something he could use for a while but not forever. They adjusted. They stopped rushing him and started working, 2 engaging his attention from the front while the others watched for the opening that patience and coordination would eventually create. The opening came. Kale went down to his knees in the snow. He felt the cold of it come through immediately, through the worn fabric of his trousers, a cold that was the cold of the mountain and completely indifferent to anything he had done or meant or decided. He had a moment of very clear perception that often came in these instants, the amber light from the basin behind him visible at the edge of his vision, pulsing its slow and steady pulse, warm and continuous and entirely unchanged by what was happening in the pass. He could hear the eggs. That faint crystalline adjustment sound, barely audible, patient. A blade found him. The specifics were less important than the fact, then another. He did not fall forward into the pass. He stayed on his knees, which was either stubbornness or some remaining function of the muscles that had not yet received the full accounting of what had been done to them. The snow around him was changing color, which he observed with the detached clarity of someone whose attention has been simplified by extremity to only the most immediate information. Behind him, inside the stone basin, 7 amber eggs pulsed quietly in the dark. The remaining hunters never made it past the entrance. What happened next was something that none of the 3 surviving hunters would describe accurately or consistently in any account they gave afterward. And the inconsistencies were not the inconsistencies of dishonesty, but of genuine perceptual failure, of something that had moved too fast and too completely outside any existing category of experience to be processed and stored in the normal way. The sound came first. It came from the basin behind the fallen man, and it was not a roar. The hunters would be clear about that in their inconsistent way in the weeks after, all 3 of them certain on this one point that it was not a roar. It was something older than a roar, something that did not belong to the category of animal vocalization at all, but to the category of geological event, of the mountain expressing something through vibration rather than sound, the cliff faces resonating with it, the frozen ground transmitting it upward through the boots and into the body, so that it was heard as much through the bones as through the ears. Silver scales caught the moonlight. That was the other thing they would agree on, the silver and the moonlight on it, and the scale of what moved through the basin's entrance into the pass and beyond it, not the details. The details would be different in every account, but the silver and what the silver implied about the size of the thing it covered, and the way the moonlight caught it like still water in the instant before everything became something other than stillness. The hunters ran and did not look back. They ran down through the mountain passes in the deep cold of the winter night. 3 men moving with a speed that had nothing to do with training or intention, and everything to do with the most fundamental information the body contains, the information that precedes thought and operates independently of it. They ran, and the Stoneback Mountains swallowed their footsteps in silence. The cold and the dark and the stone taking the sounds of their retreat and folding it into the general indifference of the high range. As if they had never been there, as if nothing had been there, as if the mountains had simply continued being what they had always been, and would continue to be long after every set of footsteps that had ever moved through them had been absorbed and forgotten. In the basin in the stone hollow beneath the overhang of black rock, 7 eggs pulsed their amber light. Slow, patient, warm. Outside the entrance to the pass, in the snow something silver moved. And then was still. The memory of dragons. Spring came late to the mountains that year. It came the way spring always came to the Stoneback Range, not as an arrival but as a slow negotiation, a gradual and grudging retreat of winter from ground it had held absolutely for months. The process had none of the speed or drama of spring in the lower lands, where the change could happen in what felt like days, where one morning the world was frozen and a week later everything was moving and green and loud with returning birds. In the mountains, winter released its grip increment by increment, as if each degree of warming had to be individually argued for, each foot of snow retreating only after extended deliberation. The passes stayed closed long after the valleys below had softened. The high basin stayed buried long after the passes had opened. But the light changed first, as it always did. Before the temperature shifted, before the snow began its reluctant melt, the quality of the light that found its way into the stone basin began to carry something different in it, a warmth that was not yet thermal but was something else. Something in the angle and the duration, the sun climbing higher in its arc each day, staying longer, sending its light deeper into the spaces that winter had kept in shadow. The eggs responded to this before anything else did. Their amber pulse, which had been steady and slow through the deepest months of cold, began to change in late winter, quickening almost imperceptibly at first, a fraction of a second trimmed from the interval between brightening and dimming, and then more noticeably, the rhythm of it becoming something closer to urgency, an internal clock counting down to a moment that had been determined long before any of the current circumstances had come to exist. The mother dragon felt this change. She had been still for a long time, still in the specific way that grief and winter and the absolute prioritization of a single remaining purpose produced stillness, a stillness that was not peace but was the thing that lived on the other side of catastrophic loss when the catastrophe is survived by necessity rather than choice. She had maintained the nest through the deepest cold. She had kept the eggs warm through the long dark. She had done it alone, and the aloneness of it was a weight she carried without complaint because complaint required an audience and she had none. And because the eggs did not need her grief, they needed her warmth and her vigilance, and the careful twice-daily turning that kept their development even and complete. She had provided all of those things, she had not stopped. The snow melted in slow, reluctant stages through the latter weeks of what was technically spring, and when it finally retreated from the stone basin floor, pulling back from the edges first, then from the center, leaving the worn, smooth stone dark with moisture and glittering in the pale morning light, 7 small dragons pulled themselves free of their shells. It did not happen all at once. It happened over the course of a single long morning, beginning before full light and finishing as the sun reached the height of the basin's western wall and sent its first direct illumination down into the depression in the stone. The first shell cracked at the point of deepest curvature, a fracture line that spread slowly from a single point of origin as if something inside had found the precise location of greatest vulnerability through long and careful consideration. The crack spread. It spread further. A pause during which nothing moved and the mother dragon held herself completely still over the nest, her golden eyes fixed on the fracturing shell with an intensity that seemed to compress the air around her. Then from inside, a pressure not sharp or sudden but sustained, a pushing from the interior that was the accumulated urgency of something that had been enclosed for long enough, and had finally, completely, become ready to not be enclosed anymore. The first small dragon came through its shell in pieces of it, copper-colored and wet, blinking in the pale mountain light with the particular baffled focus of a creature encountering the concept of the external world for the first time. It was small, impossibly small in relation to what it would eventually become, and its copper scales were soft yet, still consolidating from whatever they had been inside the shell into what they were becoming in the open air, catching the light differently with every small movement. It shook itself. The gesture was instinctive and immediate and somehow already, in the very first minutes of its existence outside the shell, entirely characteristic. A full-body shudder that started at the snout and moved in a wave back to the tail tip, dispersing shell fragments and moisture and the residue of the interior in all directions. It was loud, immediately, thoroughly, occupationally loud. The sound it made had no precedent in Kale's experience of dragons. But then, Kale was not here to observe it, and this absence was the central fact of the morning, present in every detail of what was happening in the basin, the way a missing word makes itself felt in a sentence by the shape of the space it should occupy. The mother dragon lowered her face to the first hatchling and exhaled a long, warm breath over it, and the small copper creature pushed back against her snout with its whole small body, and the exchange between them was ancient and complete and required nothing additional. The other 6 shells followed through the morning, each in its own time, each hatchling arriving with the same general bafflement and the same immediate loud declaration of presence, as if each one needed to establish immediately and without ambiguity that it was here, that it had arrived, that the world should be aware of this development and govern itself accordingly. By the time the sun had climbed to the basin's western wall, all 7 were free and moving, or attempting to move, which in the early hours of a hatchling dragon's existence was a project of considerable ambition and limited coordination, involving much falling and recovering and falling again, each fall met with an increase in volume rather than any revision of confidence. They were copper-colored, curious, and loud, and the stone basin that had been so still and so serious for so long rang with the particular chaotic energy of 7 new creatures discovering simultaneously that they had bodies, that those bodies had capabilities, and that the world was enormously larger and more interesting than the inside of a shell. Their mother watched all of this. She moved among them with a care that was completely continuous, a steady background of supervision and adjustment, nudging a hatchling back from the basin's edge, repositioning one who had managed to get herself wedged between 2 stones, responding to the constant vocal demands of all 7 with a patience that seemed inexhaustible. She was different in this mode than she had been in the long still months of the vigil, more present, more in motion. Her attention dispersed across 7 simultaneous sources of need, rather than concentrated inward on the single task of maintaining warmth and waiting. But the difference went deeper than behavior. There was something in her that had reanimated, something that the long winter of grief and solitary endurance had compressed into a small dense thing, preserved but reduced, and that was now expanding back toward its full dimensions in the presence of what she had preserved it for. She had held through everything, and here was the result of the holding. 7 copper-colored creatures falling over themselves on the basin floor, loud as anything alive. On their first day, she guided them toward the basin's edge. It was not a long journey by the measure of any subsequent journey they would take, but for creatures who had been in the world for only a few hours it was substantial, and the mother dragon managed it with the combination of encouragement and firm redirection that the situation required, moving them gradually across the basin floor toward the lower eastern rim where the wall was shortest and the view beyond it most accessible. She showed them the sky first. She raised her head above the rim and they crowded around her, all 7 of them pressing against her sides and against each other, jostling for position, craning their small copper necks upward. And she let them look for a long time without moving, giving them the full unmediated experience of it. The enormous blue, the clouds moving in their unhurried way across the upper air, the particular quality of mountain sky which was different from any other sky, cleaner and more absolute, the blue going darker toward the zenith in a way that suggested the sky had depth to it, had layers, went up further than any fixed point could follow. She showed them the valleys below, the long green-gray descents from the mountain's base, the distant thread of water visible in the lowest ground, the dark mass of the ashwood forest at the edge of the visible world, and beyond that the suggestion of the lower lands where human kingdoms arranged themselves along rivers and roads and considered themselves the primary business of the world. She showed them the shape of what they had entered. And then she turned them away from the eastern rim and moved them toward the basin's entrance, toward the narrow pass that opened into the mountain approaches below, and here her pace changed. She moved more slowly. The 7 hatchlings followed, less jostling now, something in her manner transmitting itself to them through whatever frequency mothers and their young shared, a signal below the threshold of the conscious that said, "Attend to this is different, this requires a different quality of presence." At the entrance to the pass, where the snow had been deepest through the long winter, something caught the spring light. She stopped. The young ones crowded around her legs, looking up at her face and then in the direction her gaze was directed, trying to find in the ordinary mountain ground what she was seeing there. They found stone and the last traces of retreating snow and the early exploratory growth of the small plants that were first to return to high ground in spring, nothing that their new and limited understanding of the world flagged as significant. They pushed against her with their small heads, the physical vocabulary of young creatures wanting acknowledgement, wanting explanation, wanting the comfort of response. She was still in a way that stilled them. The mother dragon stood at the entrance to the pass for a long time, long enough that the sun moved perceptibly, long enough that the hatchlings, who had been filled with the restless kinetic urgency of first-day existence, settled into something quieter, something that followed her lead without understanding it, sitting or lying at her feet, watching the same unremarkable ground she was watching, learning for the first time that there were things in the world that required stillness to properly apprehend. She lowered her face to the ground. It was a slow movement and a complete one, not a sniffing or a practical investigation, but a gesture. The kind of movement that has meaning built into its form rather than its function. She lowered her great silver face to the cold stone of the mountain pass and held it there, and the quality of the silence around her was the quality of something being acknowledged, something being honored in the only available language, which was the language of the body and its willingness to bow. The seven young ones watched. They did not understand what they were watching, not yet. They were too new to the world to have the categories required for understanding. But they watched it, and they held it in the way that things witnessed early and completely are held, not as information but as imprint, not as knowledge but as something more primary than knowledge, something that lives in the deeper registers of a creature's experience and waits there for the understanding to eventually grow up around it. It was a thing the young ones would remember without understanding it, not yet. They remembered the stillness of her. They remembered the way the spring light fell on the entrance to the pass and on the stone beneath it. They remembered the gesture of her lowering, the specific quality of it, its slowness, its completeness, the total absence of anything reluctant or performative in it. They remembered the silence that came after and how long she stood there and how it had felt to stand beside her without knowing why. They carried it with them when they left the basin, which they did in the way that young dragons eventually leave the places of their beginnings. Gradually, in increasing ranges, first the lower mountain approaches and then the farther valleys and eventually the wider world, each departure longer than the last until the departures became the permanent condition and the returns became the exception. She brought them back every spring for the years that they were young enough to return to. She brought them back to the stone basin with its worn smooth floor and its overhang of black rock. And every spring she walked them to the entrance of the pass and stood in the spring light and lowered her face to the ground. And every spring they stood beside her and the imprint deepened, accumulated, built layers over layers in the way that repeated experiences build their meaning slowly, like sediment. Like the slow, patient geology of things that are not in a hurry to be understood, because they are confident in their own persistence. As they grew, they came to understand. It was not a sudden comprehension but a gradual one, the understanding assembling itself over years from the accumulating evidence of the gesture and the place and the stories that their mother told in the way dragons told things, not in language as human beings used language with its sequential arrangement of symbols, but in the deeper and less linear medium through which dragons transmitted what they needed to transmit, a medium closer to direct experience than to description. They came to understand that someone had stood in that narrow pass and had not moved. They came to understand what that meant in its full weight, not the simple fact of a man with a sword standing between armed hunters and a dragon's nest, which was an event that could be described in a sentence, but everything that the event contained and implied. The exile who had arrived at the far edge of the world with nothing except what he still was when everything external had been stripped away. The months of the vigil, the fire at the basin's edge and the hunted meat left on a flat stone. The bolt removed slowly over an afternoon, and the voice speaking throughout, and the stillness she had maintained while someone she had no reason to trust did something that required complete trust to survive. They came to understand what it cost, not in the abstract but in the specific, what it cost a man who had already lost everything that the world assigned as worth keeping to then spend what remained in the currency of the only thing he had found worth spending it on. They were very old when they understood it fully. Dragons live long beyond the measure of human years, and the full understanding of some things is not available until the living has accumulated enough depth to receive it. But they carried it with them from the beginning in the form of the imprint, and the imprint shaped them in ways they would only partially be able to account for as they moved through the centuries of their lives. The young ones grew enormous. This happened in stages that were perceptible across years rather than months, the copper of their hatchling scales deepening and cooling through adolescence into a silver that was their mother's silver. A silver that seemed to carry light rather than simply reflect it, a quality that suggested the scales had opinions about illumination rather than merely participating in it. Their bodies gained the mass and the presence that adult dragons carried like a gravitational field, a density of existence that altered the quality of any space they occupied. Their wings developed from the small and useless appendages of the basin days into instruments of genuine flight, broad and powerful, capable of carrying them across distances that would take a human traveler weeks on foot. They scattered across the wild places of the world, as adult dragons do, seeking the remote and the unoccupied, the high places and the deep forests and the unmapped margins where the primary business of human kingdoms did not reach. They were not hermits by nature, but they were careful by necessity, in the way that creatures that have been hunted across generations learn to be careful, a caution that was not fearfulness but a clear-eyed accounting of historical facts. But they carried something with them. It moved with them across the wide world, into the high places and the remote margins, as durable and as present as their silver scales. It was a recognition, a way of seeing, a particular quality of attention that engaged when they encountered, in the human world below them, something specific. A quality they had no word for but knew immediately when they saw it, the quality of a person moving through a world that had decided it did not have room for them, carrying themselves with the particular bearing of someone who has stopped expecting welcome and has not yet found anything to put in its place. They had seen this quality in the stories their mother told. They had felt its outline in the imprint of the spring gesture, the lowered face, the long silent standing. They recognized it when they encountered it in the world because recognition, for creatures with the kind of memory that dragons carried, was not a matter of active searching but of simple response, the world presenting something and the interior responding unmistakably with the deep register vibration of, "This here I know this." When they encountered those who were lost, wandering, cast out by the places that should have kept them, they did not look away. This was not a policy or a decision. It was what the imprint had made them into, creatures for whom a specific kind of human suffering was not invisible, for whom the exile on a road that led away from everything had a face that was, in some sense, always the same face. The face of the man who had sat on a stone outcropping in a mountain basin in deep winter and set down his sword and said in plain words that he meant no harm. What they did with that recognition varied. They were not saviors in any systematic sense. They were not in the business of rescue or intervention in the way that stories sometimes suggested. But they were present in ways that mattered, a warmth on a cold ridge, a sense of being seen by something ancient and beyond the ordinary scale of judgment, a moment of acknowledgement in the wordless medium that required no common language because it operated below language entirely. Sometimes they brought shelter in the practical sense. Sometimes they brought something harder to name, the simple and enormous fact of being recognized by something that had no reason to recognize you, in the specific way that the exiled and the outcast needed to be recognized, which was not as a problem to be solved or a threat to be assessed or a category to be assigned, but simply as a presence worthy of acknowledgement. They remembered, in the wordless way that deep things are remembered, that kindness had once stood in a narrow pass with a rusted sword and asked for nothing in return. The kingdom of Valdris never knew what became of the man they exiled. This was not unusual. Kingdoms did not, as a general practice, maintain records of the people they discarded. The administrative apparatus that had processed Kale's dismissal, the closed hearing, the formal words about treason, the guardroom and the borrowed sword and the door that opened onto the eastern road, had completed its function when the door closed, and the function had never included any provision for afterward. He had ceased to exist within the kingdom's accounting of itself, and the kingdom had continued to exist without him. As kingdoms did, turning its attention to the next thing and the next, the machinery of power and territory and the endless management of who belonged and who did not grinding forward on its own momentum. They wrote no record of him and left no stone with his name. There was no grave marker in any of the kingdom's cemeteries, no entry in any military register noting his final disposition, no mention in any chronicle of the eastern campaigns of what had become of the soldier who had lowered his torch in the village of Imren and walked out of the frame of his kingdom's story. He had passed through the world's official accounting of itself and left no legible trace, in the way that the world's official accounting tended to handle the people it had decided did not merit the permanence of record. The dragons remembered him forever. Not as a name, they did not have his name, had never had it, and names were in any case a human instrument for a human kind of memory. They remembered him in the way that dragons remembered the things that had shaped them, which was completely and without the attrition that human memory suffered across time. They remembered the quality of him, the stillness of setting down a sword, the voice that spoke throughout the long afternoon of the bolt's removal, the fire at the basin's edge, the food left on the flat stone, the figure standing in the narrow pass against the impossible arithmetic of the numbers. They remembered what he had known and acted on, that some things were worth the full cost of protecting, and that the full cost, when it came, was to be met without flinching and without asking for anything back. The kingdom of Valdris rose and fell in the centuries that followed, as kingdoms did, its borders shifting and its rulers changing and its grand sense of its own permanence eroding eventually into the historical record, and then into the dimmer territory of legend, and then into the simple fact of absence, the way that all institutions eventually went when the conditions that had sustained them changed enough. The village of Imren was rebuilt and grew and eventually became something larger, and the people who lived there did not know the name of the soldier who had refused to burn it. The mountains remained. The stone basin remained, its worn smooth floor and its overhang of black rock unchanged across the centuries in any way that mattered. And in the wild places of the world, in the high passes and the unmapped margins, silver dragons moved through the long centuries carrying the imprint of a spring morning and a gesture made in a mountain pass. And when they encountered the lost and the exiled, they turned toward them rather than away. And this turning was the living extension of a memory that no official record had preserved and no kingdom had thought worth keeping. That was more than enough. It was in the measure of things that actually persisted, that actually moved through the world and changed what they touched and continued changing it long after the specific circumstances of their origin had dissolved into the past, considerably more than enough. It was everything.